G'day, welcome to the channel. My name's Jared, this is Growers Academy. Today's episode is going to be about preparing coir substrate for planting. There's quite a few steps involved in preparing this substrate for planting compared to rock wool or soil, for example. Because it does come compressed and dry, which saves a lot of cost on freight, we do have to rehydrate it, and there's a lot of different opinions and methods on how you can do this. What I'm going to share today is just how I like to do it, and obviously your circumstances are going to vary as well. First off with the coir slabs is I recommend that you handle them with two hands. If you're rough with them, what can happen is that they'll break generally right through where the dripper hole is drilled, and that makes it more difficult because trying to install a spike into a crack in the slab is going to be a lot harder. And often what will happen is the water from the dripper spike will go right through the crack and out, and the section around here won't hydrate very well. If you buy substrate that has a larger chip, it's going to be more prone to cracking compared to one with more pith, for example. So when we're putting these down, first of all, it's worth noting that you may have an unsymmetrical slab. For example, the first one here has a section cut out, and the last one on here doesn't. So this has two sets of planting holes, 4 which you can see are cut out and 4 which are still covered, which is you can use for multiple seasons or multiple crops or interplanting, for example. So when you put the first one down, you need to decide whether you want this at the front of the gutter or this at the front of the gutter, because the pattern that goes down needs to continue depending how the first one is placed. Now that we've got our slab on the gutter, it's important that first of all we put it in the middle of the gutter. If you have it to one side, when they expand, the gutter is going to get a tilt on it and lean down the row. So you don't want to have it all the way to one side like this, because that gutter is going to end up twisting, and the slabs, as they expand to get heavier, they're going to fall off the other side of the gutter. So you want to make sure they're in the middle. Next step, once it's centered in the middle of the gutter, you'll notice that this brick, it can actually slide in both ways like such. So you want to make sure that that brick is centered inside the bag. What can happen is if it's all the way to one end like this, when that expands, this end's going to be really tight and the other end's going to be loose and have an air space like here. The other thing too is when it's slid across like this, you actually can't see the hole for the dripper spike. So the staff, when they come along with their spike, there's nowhere to put that in. And then once you actually slide that along, now you can actually see the hole to put the spike in. The next thing worth mentioning as well is that sometimes the bag can rotate around the brick. I've just exaggerated this where you can actually see the drain hole on the top and the planting hole is on the side. So what will happen is it'll expand like this and the planting hole will be on the edge of the brick. So you need to make sure that it's centered like such, so when it expands, that comes to the top. With this first slab on the gutter, you want to avoid having that off the edge like such, especially if you've got drain holes. What I've done on this one is actually the first one, put a bit of tape over the drain hole, because what can happen is it can drip and it can come out of the end of the gutter. But you want to have it such that that plastic bag is just barely over the end, and when it expands it's going to come up like this and be flush with the end of the gutter. So the next part to this is actually the spacing, which is also critical with getting these expanded nice and evenly. So we left our gap in the end of the bag here, so when that expands it's going to come up like such. If we place the next slab too close, what that's going to do is the two of them are going to push together and potentially push apart from each other, and they'll do like a push like such, and then the slabs will be crooked all the way down the row. And what will happen too is that the substrate won't expand properly in that end because it has nowhere to go and the roots won't go in there. So with the spacing, you want to make sure that that flap is not underneath. Pull the flap out. So two flaps can go over each other like that, it's not a problem. And then you're measuring more from the end of the brick in one to the start of the brick in the other one. And what I recommend is, it depends how thick your slab is, but a roughly 2 to 3 finger gap between the end of one brick and the start of the next brick, so that two slabs can actually expand together and not be squished. So the last step now is pretty much getting our dripper spike and putting it in the slab. I do recommend, if you're buying these, that you get them pre-drilled. The more pre-drilled holes, the better, because the swelling and expansion is going to be more uniform. If you do have broken slabs, you really need to get a dripper into each of those sections. If there's a section that's broken either end and it has no dripper in the middle, it's not going to expand very well. So with these drippers, when you put them in, you don't want to have them on an angle like such, because when this expands up, what's going to happen is it's going to push it up and fall out to the side. So it's important that when it goes in all of the way, pretty much as firm as possible. And then we have all of them put in. If you have any now, what I suggest is that you take the spike off and revert it and just block it. And then we just put it underneath like such. If you just leave it on hanging on the ground, there's going to be a lot of water that's going to go everywhere during the next few processes. So now we just got to go ahead and repeat the drippers for the whole area. You also want to avoid making the slab wet, for example, if the roof is dripping or you're cleaning the greenhouse, because once that slab expands, it's very difficult to try and find where the hole was. So staff will spend a lot of time looking for it, so just avoid getting them wet at all. So the next step really depends on what you bought. So for me, the next step is filling or expanding, some people call it, followed by washing potentially. If you've got a lot of tannin or you want to recycle the water and you have UV treatment, you definitely want to do some more washing. Depends again if you bought single washed, double washed, and then the final step, buffering. So if you have bought buffered, that's going to save you a lot of time, or you skip the step. If you haven't and you bought something cheaper, you want to look into buffering. So traditionally for the feeling, I like to look at what the water holding capacity is at expansion. So the manufacturer will tell you, usually it's 50 to 70% for Coir. So for example, if you had a 26 litre slab like I do, so a 26 litre slab with 65% water holding capacity is about 17 litres. So if we're going to be feeling that, I like to give it about 100 or 150 ml shot at a time and then give it a break in between. Just because when you first start feeling the slab, it's quite hydrophobic and the water tends to run off the surface. And also because there's a space between the dripper holes, the water needs to move out latitudinally. So we need to give it some time for the water to move through those coconut fibers. So I have 4 dripper spikes per slab. So if I give it a 150 ml shot, it's like giving 600 mils to the whole substrate. So if I have my 17 litres divided by my 600 mils, I need to give 28.5 cycles to actually expand it up. And if, for example, I have, an 8-minute gap between each cycle, it's going to take 226 minutes or about 3.8 hours, for example. So again, I usually work on that 100 to 150 ml shot, followed by about an 8-minute break between them before running again. In terms of the EC and pH for this process, I tend not to use any fertilizer. You can use it if you want to do extra buffering, but usually I set the EC to like 0.4 or 0, just using fresh water, and the pH to 5.8 that we actually want in the substrate for planting. I just want to show you, for example, this is the dry Coir. If I get some fresh water and I pour it on top, see how it just runs off the side, and actually it's still dry underneath. And even if I tip it in slowly, it's not actually absorbing that well. It actually goes to the side and underneath the slab. So essentially we need to do something similar where we tip it very slowly over the substrate to allow it to slowly expand and then move through. Because this section between the two drippers is going to be the last section which dries up. Section around the dripper is going to start to wet up first. So if you have a 4 litre dripper and you divide it by 60, you give 66.6 mils per minute. So if you want to give 150 mils divided by 66, it's going to take 2.3 minutes. So here on my Aqua X, what I've done is I've set it to start at 340 for 2 minutes and 20 seconds with a 7-minute break between them and our 29 cycles. So this is going to go back to back every 7 minutes for 2 minutes and 20 seconds until it reaches 29 cycles and then turns off. There's already some water coming out even after starting the irrigation. So you can see after the first cycle, it's just wet up around the hole. So it's going to take a long time for it to fill out to the side like such. And it's just puffed up around where the dripper spike is. While we're waiting for the second cycle, it's worth noting that the water that comes off here, I recommend that you dump it if possible. So my water collects into this pit with a pump like such, and then instead of returning it back into the tank, you want to install a diversion valve and pump the water out and waste it, just because it's going to have a lot of tannin, sodium and chloride in there, which are no good for the plants. It's also important that you make sure you have enough water, because filling these slabs is going to take a lot. For example, I've only got 17 litres times by 9 of them. I'm going to need 153 litres, which is most of this tank here, just to expand them, not including the washing and buffering step. So now you can see that the slab has expanded and even some of the water is starting to drain out of the slabs. And it looks expanded, but actually in between the two cubes, you can see it still hasn't, and it's actually dry in there. So it will, if you leave it overnight, the water will slowly go in there, and then the middle will actually wet up. Some of the sections are better than others. It might depend on the dripper placement, or if you have any block drippers, for example. The next step, you can go through and fluff up the slab. Here you can actually see one is stuck underneath the other, and it's pulled the bag down slightly. So all you need to do is come here, pull up the side of the bag like such, and do for the other side. So that'll allow the bag to finish the expansion at the end here. You can see in the gutter the water starting to come out of the slab and how brown it is. Okay, so now you can see it's gotten dark. I've got the lights on in here. The slabs are expanded, so that means you can go ahead and plant on them. That's not a problem. I do recommend that you continue the process that you were doing, which is the filling, and go into the second phase, which I like to call flushing. And the flushing, the whole goal of that is to get rid of as much tannin, salinity and chloride as possible. So you can do this one or two ways. One, if you want to save money, keep going with the fresh water with the low EC. Or if you want to do extra buffering or go straight into buffering, now's the time you want to put in your fertilizer. I'm going to go and continue with the fresh water for now, just to save on cost and simplicity. The amount of flushing and washing you need to do will depend on the quality of the product you bought and what type of product you've bought as well. The older coir, which seems to sit outside in Sri Lanka and India under the rainfall, that gets a bit more wash, seems to be a lot more stable and doesn't have as much issues, but the fresher stuff still tends to have a bit higher sodium chloride and tannin in it. Also, now that the slabs have risen, you'll notice that the spike is barely hanging in there. You most likely will have some spikes that during that process where they've gone up have fallen out and gone onto the ground. So then as you do that fluffing up process down the row, pick up the dripper, put it back in, so you can get good washing, flushing, and buffering at that same time. If that dripper sits on the ground, that section of the slab, it's not going to get the same treatment. If it doesn't get the same treatment, you're going to have a bit of uniformity in the substrate as well. So now we've finished our second step of the flushing or washing. We can move on to the final step, which is buffering. Again, you don't have to do buffering. You might have already bought buffered, but I always question about how well it's been buffered. You can send the sample results to a lab and get them checked. For example, I use Agvita. I just do it as a soil analysis. The results are going to come back quite high, but I use that as a standard. So each batch I get, I can compare it to the last one, and it can help prepare me for the next one on how much I need to buffer it, or whether tells me whether they've done a good job or not. If you buy unbuffered, you are going to save a bit of money, but now you're going to spend it out of your own pocket on fertilizer to do this step. So the buffering process pretty much involves using a lot of calcium nitrate to displace other cations like sodium to make the substrate more favorable for growing in. Other nutrients that are also going to get locked up by the cation exchange capacity in the slab: manganese, molybdenum, and iron to a degree, depending on what substrate and how you're growing. So I recommend that those 3 or 4, you add at least an extra 10 or 15% fertilizer if you're coming from rock wool that you would normally use for your start recipe. Increase that more so at the beginning. You also now have the opportunity to set the EC and the pH that you want for the start of your crop. So I'm going to continue with the 5.8 pH that we were already doing with the filling and the flushing. And now we're also going to introduce some EC, which is our fertilizer. So I'm going to fill the substrate at an EC of 3.5. And then what that allows me to do is drip at an EC of 4, slightly higher when I first plant. And that's going to help the roots go from the higher concentration, where they're going to be in the cube, down into the slab with the lower concentration. So I have 150 litres here in my tank. So I've got just over 1 litre here, and previously I did a 10:1 dilution on my mix and it came back just over 4. So just a little bit less than 1.5 litres, somewhere between that is going to be the ideal amount. So I'm going to add the B, which I've got here, and then do the same for the A. And again, my A, and make sure you know you're not adding the A and the B together in the tank at the bottom and then filling. You want to make sure your tank is in the process of filling or already filled before you add these, just because the two can react and precipitate with each other before you add the water. So now we just want to make sure that it's mixed really well. If you do leave the mix for some time, it will reach equilibrium, but we want to just speed up that process for the sake of this video. So now we've got our pH and EC meter here we're going to put in. So we've got a pH of 6.3, which is fine, 6.2. We've got a reading on EC of 3. So we're going to go ahead and add a bit more fertilizer in. Okay, so now we've got 3.4, it's pretty damn close. We can go ahead and start our buffering now. So what I've got ahead and done is set up the same strategy as before. We're going to start now with our 2-minute and 20 cycle, with our 7 minutes between them, and we're going to do 29 cycles. If you got a float like this, that's going to automatically fill up your tank. You want to go ahead and close this, because as the tank depletes, the EC in here is going to slowly reduce. So for me, I just got this tap here. I'm just going to close off the water to the reservoir. Just make sure that if you do have a pump without a minimum float, that you look out that when the water goes down, you're not going to run the pump dry. You might need to fill it back up, make another mix like we just did, and then continue with the flushing again. I've got my substrate probe in here after I finish my washing, just to check the moisture content. It's currently reading 38%. Last night I gave it some more cycles, and even today I gave it some more. It did come up slightly, but it's kind of sitting around that 40% mark. Moved it to this spot and it's come up to 44, but that seems to be about the saturation, so we'll be able to get ready to calibrate that later. Alright guys, that wraps up the video. Hopefully the content was helpful for you, or you learned something from this. If you have any questions, put them down in the comments below. If you want to look forward to other videos like this, please hit the subscribe button, and thanks for watching. Cheers.